October 7, 1941. The morning mist clung to the fields outside the small Soviet town of Insensk. Steel tracks rumbled over the frozen earth as elements of Germany's 4th Panzer Division advanced, confident the road ahead was theirs. They were hunting the broken remains of the Red Army, desperate men retreating east, their defenses in tatters. But what the Germans couldn't see was the trap waiting in the tree line. From the shadows, the Soviet 4th Tank Brigade erupted in fire. Shells screamed across the fields, slamming into Panzer armor. One after another, German tanks burst into flames, crews scrambling for cover as Soviet guns tore into their formation. In minutes, 6 panzers were reduced to burning wrecks. 3 more were crippled. Dozens of German soldiers lay dead. The ambush threw the German column into chaos. For days, fighting raged outside Insensk, neither side gaining more than blood and exhaustion. Though the town would eventually fall to the Wehrmacht, this small clash carried a grim warning. Moscow would not be taken without a fight, and the resistance the Germans faced here was only a shadow of the storm that lay ahead. The summer of 1941 belonged to Hitler. Operation Barbarossa had shattered the Soviet frontier in a matter of weeks. City after city fell. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were marched into captivity. To the German high command, the road to victory seemed wide open. But in Berlin's war rooms, a dangerous argument was unfolding. Field marshals urged a direct strike at Moscow, the beating heart of Soviet command, the hub of its railways, the nerve center of its communications. Take Moscow, they argued, and the Red Army would collapse. Hitler disagreed. To him, Moscow was just a blot on the map. Instead, he turned the strength of Army Group Center south toward the fertile lands of Ukraine and its vital oil and grain. The gamble paid off in the short term. Ukraine fell, its fields and resources now under the swastika. But in the east, the clock was ticking. Every day spent in the south brought the German army closer to the mud, snow, and bitter cold of a Russian winter. And when the order finally came to take Moscow, the Wehrmacht would discover that the weather was not the only enemy waiting for them. By the time the Germans turned north again, the season had shifted. The bright summer skies of Operation Barbarossa were gone, replaced by steel-gray clouds and biting winds. The rains came first, turning the dirt roads of the Soviet heartland into rivers of mud. The Russians had a word for it, Rasputitsa, the season when the earth itself swallowed armies. Panzers that once raced across the steppe now crawled at a walking pace, their treads clogged and engines straining. Supply trucks sank axle deep, horses collapsed in the muck. The longer the columns stretched, the more fragile they became. Fuel and ammunition trickled to the front. Spare parts were almost impossible to come by. German soldiers, dressed for summer, now shivered in the damp cold, their morale eroding as surely as their boots in the mire. Still, Hitler's orders were clear: push on to Moscow. His generals knew the window for a swift victory was closing. If the capital was not taken before winter's full fury arrived, the campaign could stall, and stalling, in Russia, was a death sentence. What none of them knew was that the Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, was already preparing its next move. Late September 1941. The mud had not yet frozen, but the order was given. Operation Typhoon was unleashed. This was to be the killing blow, the final thrust that would seize Moscow and end the Soviet war. Army Group Center hurled its might eastward, nearly 2 million men, thousands of tanks and guns, and the confidence of an army that had known nothing but victory. Their plan was brutal and simple: encircle the Soviet armies standing in their path, crush them, and open the road to the capital. The first strikes were devastating. To the south, German panzers closed their trap near Bryansk, sealing in 3 Soviet field armies. To the north, another encirclement near Vyazma trapped 4 more. Soviet commanders, bound by rigid orders and slow communication, reacted too late. For 3 relentless weeks, the Wehrmacht tightened its grip. Artillery pounded, Stukas screamed overhead, and desperate Red Army troops fought to the last. When the smoke cleared, nearly 1 million Soviet soldiers were dead or captured. The road to Moscow lay open, but the price had been high, and the clock had been ticking. Every day spent in these killing grounds closer to winter and to disaster. Then came the rain. At first, it was a cold drizzle. Then it became a torrent, soaking men and machines alike. The roads, if they could still be called roads, dissolved into bottomless mud. This was the dreaded Rasputitsa, the season that had humbled armies for centuries. Panzers that once cut across Europe like a knife now crawled, their treads churning in place. Trucks and artillery bogged down axle-deep. Soldiers waded through knee-high sludge, their uniforms heavy with filth and water. Horses collapsed in exhaustion, supplies rotted in their crates. Repair crews were overwhelmed. Every mile forward cost hours of labor, gallons of fuel, and more than a little luck. Entire columns stalled for days, waiting for corduroy roads, rough tracks of logs, to be built by freezing, mud-caked soldiers. In the south, the 2nd Panzer Group and 2nd Army slowed to a crawl. In the north, forests, swamps, and rivers strangled the advance. The Wehrmacht was no longer blitzing. It was bleeding, in time, in strength, and in morale. The Red Army was retreating, but not in defeat. Each day the Germans sank deeper into the mire. The Soviets bought precious time they would soon use to strike back. Moscow braced for the storm. The German army was closing in, but Stalin refused to flee. Instead, he summoned his most capable commander, Georgy Zhukov, to organize the city's defense. The orders were brutal in their simplicity: hold Moscow at all costs. Every able body was put to work. Over 250,000 civilians, men, women, even school children, dug trenches, built bunkers, and laid miles of barbed wire. Anti-tank ditches scarred the earth in great arcs around the capital. Factories that once produced radios, bicycles, and toys now forged rifles, shells, and tank parts day and night. The city was under martial law. Food was rationed, spirits were grim but unbroken. Then came a stroke of luck and brilliant espionage. Richard Sorg, a Soviet spy in Tokyo, confirmed that Japan would not invade Siberia. Stalin seized the opportunity, ordering 30 divisions from the Far East to Moscow. These were no raw recruits. They were hardened veterans, trained for winter warfare, some of them elite ski troops. As the temperature dropped, so did the Red Army's fear. The German advance had slowed, the city was armed, and for the first time since the summer, there was hope. When the Germans came again, they met a different enemy. Rolling out of the mist were the Soviet Union's new steel beasts, the T-34 tanks. Sleek, sloped armor shrugged off German shells that had torn through every other Soviet tank before. Its wide tracks bit into the mud where panzers sank, and its 76mm gun could kill a panzer at ranges where the Germans' own fire bounced harmlessly away. For the Wehrmacht's veterans, it was a shock. For new recruits, it was terror. And the tanks weren't alone. From hidden positions, the Red Army unleashed the howl of the Katyusha rocket launchers. Dozens of projectiles screamed through the air, exploding in waves that shattered formations and seared the earth. German troops called them Stalin's organs, not for their shape, but for the dreadful wail that preceded destruction. Every engagement now cost the invaders more. The panzers still advanced, but slower. Supply lines groaned under constant Soviet raids. Confidence began to crack. The men of Army Group Center had been promised a swift victory. Instead, they found themselves in a grinding, bloody contest against an enemy that refused to die and was growing stronger by the day. November 1941. The cold had hardened the ground, and with it, German resolve. Once more, Army Group Center surged forward, determined to finish the job. Through frozen forests and snow-swept fields, the panzers clawed their way east. Villages burned in their wake, Soviet units fought and fell, and the Wehrmacht inched ever closer to its prize. By the final days of November, German scouts could see the spires of Moscow from their positions, barely 10 kilometers away. Victory seemed within reach. But the price was brutal. Each step forward was paid for in blood. Divisions that had started the campaign with thousands of men now fought as shattered remnants of a few hundred. Tanks broke down and were abandoned in the snow. Ammunition arrived late, fuel in dribbles, food in crumbs. Still, Hitler demanded the city. His commanders pressed on, convinced the Soviets were finished. They were wrong. In the shadows of Moscow, fresh Red Army divisions were moving into position. What the Germans didn't know was that their final push had already failed. They had reached the limit of their strength, and the Soviet counterblow was about to begin. December 5, 1941. The frozen air over Moscow split with the thunder of guns. But this time, they were Soviet guns. Zhukov had been waiting, gathering his reserves in silence, and now he struck. From the north, the south, and straight from the city's defenses, Red Army troops surged forward. Fresh divisions from Siberia, their white winter camouflage blending with the snow, cut into the flanks of the exhausted Germans. Ski troops raced across frozen rivers, striking where the panzers could not follow. The Wehrmacht, already starved of fuel, food, and ammunition, reeled under the assault. What had been an orderly front became a patchwork of desperate retreats and sudden collapses. German units, overextended and half-frozen, abandoned positions they had fought for weeks to take. By mid-December, the counteroffensive had driven the invaders back from the gates of Moscow. Villages and roads once marked with swastikas now flew the red banner again. Hitler raged, refusing to authorize a full withdrawal. His men dug in, unprepared for the months of bitter fighting still to come. The dream of seizing Moscow in 1941 was dead, and with it, the illusion of a swift victory in the east. When the snows settled, the truth was undeniable. Moscow still stood. The Wehrmacht had been driven back, their vaunted blitzkrieg blunted for the first time. The cost had been staggering. The Red Army had lost between 600,000 and 1.3 million men, soldiers who would never return home. Yet in that sacrifice lay survival. Stalin had held his capital, and with it, the beating heart of the Soviet war effort. For Hitler, the blow was far deeper than the frozen ground. Between 250,000 and 400,000 German soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. The army that had swept across Europe was now locked in a war of attrition it was ill-prepared to fight. The dream of a quick, total victory over the Soviet Union had melted away in the snow outside Moscow. From this point forward, the initiative would begin to shift. The Red Army had proven it could stop and even push back the most feared army in the world. The Battle of Moscow was no mere defense of a city. It was the first crack in Hitler's war machine, a crack that in time would shatter it completely.